So what did we learn at this conference? I'm going to propose the following. We now glimpse the end of Europe. What do I mean by that? For the moment, we see a natural resting point or equilibrium in which one can reform or perfect existing policies and processes, but not fundamentally transform them. And this is a good thing. Okay, let's break that down. Number one, for the moment. So it's been a very quick decade of enlargement. A lot has happened, and the next decade won't be as quick because the things that were easier got done, and you're left with the things that are more difficult. We just heard that. And we also saw in the course of the conference that what happens in the process of transformation is that old habits that are harder to get rid of are still there, or unintended consequences arise, or new or sometimes unwelcome coalitions arise, new constraints impose themselves, and you get a lot of diversity. And in a context of diversity, you have to work through it. A polity needs to work through it in order to get to the point where they can be as dynamic as they were, say, a decade or two ago. So it will take a while to do that, and so for the moment, we're looking at something like an equilibrium point in which people are going to adjust and perfect policies that are currently on the books. The end of Europe. So what do I mean by the end of Europe? Well, let's call it the ends of Europe, because there are different dimensions to it. Number one, the geographical end of Europe. So here I'll also build on what was said earlier. Western Balkans, yes, that process is already in motion. Yes, but slowly. I think there was agreement throughout the conference that once we start talking about Ukraine, or we talk about Moldova, Belarus, Turkey, or something like that, we're talking about a very difficult long-term process that would require fundamental transformation. And the binding constraint, despite what people say in editorials and publications other than The Economist, is not just and even primarily public opinion in the European Union. It's actually the real situation on the ground with regard to domestic politics, with regard to economics, and with regard to geopolitics in these regions, as we see in recent months. There are objective reasons, as was mentioned, why this needs to go slowly. Second dimension of the ends of Europe, policies. So diversity makes it difficult to generate new policies. We see this most clearly in the euro, which is still not a universal policy in Europe, and it's a policy that relies for its effectiveness on convergence of macroeconomic policy, and macroeconomic policy includes all sorts of things, as we're finding out now. No one can really even say what it would mean for Italy to be convergent with Germany in a way that would make it healthily able to be in the same monetary union. So that will take a long time. Fiscal union probably is too much to ask of the diverse member states of the European Union. There's diversity in implementation, a surprising amount of it we found at this conference. There's diversity built into a lot of policies, into foreign policy, into Schengen. We didn't talk about immigration, but into immigration as well. And there are transitional policies, as Frank pointed out, that persist over time and take decades to overcome. And all this has to do with underlying convergence of economies that is a social process, a political process, an economic process, a process of the transformation of varieties of capitalism that takes decades. And everybody pretty much agrees that that's the case. So we're looking at a long-term process that's necessary for the European Union to be dynamic in a way that it was before. So an end of Europe in a political sense. But this is a good thing. Why is it a good thing? So when people say the end of Europe, so the first thing, I know this because I'm always cast in this role, the instinct is always, okay, this is some kind of American who doesn't really fully understand how we think here in European institutions, has a kind of quasi-Eurosceptic message about what's going on. But that's not my intent at all. My intent is to praise Europe in this regard. That Europe has come to a point, not just where it's digesting something that is a heroic achievement, but where it is a mature polity. So in the course of constitutional development, polities come to a point where the central question in the constitutional development of the polity is no longer, will we still exist? So, you know, for a time in the early American Republic, for a time in the Weimar Republic, pretty much all of the Weimar Republic, the question was, you know, will it still continue to exist? And indeed, many people still think about the European Union as ever closer union is required because otherwise the European Union may cease to exist, or the euro is required because otherwise the European Union will cease to exist. But the European Union has been around longer than most established democracies in the world today. It is deeply embedded in the interests and ideals of all Europeans. It's not going anywhere. In fact, I'd be willing to bet anybody lots of money the British aren't going to go anywhere either. The question is no longer, will it survive? The question is only, what kind of European Union is it going to be? And in that context, one can afford to step back, one can even afford to cut back in some ways. One can afford to have a moment of equilibrium, one can afford to digest, one can afford to do all this kind of stuff. In other words, one can afford to think of the European Union as a mature polity that is engaged in this moment of equilibrium and reflection. And one can say that it is the most successful voluntary international organization in human history, and that enlargement is one of its greatest successes. As I said before in this conference, no more effective policy instrument has been used by any advanced industrial democracy in the post-Cold War period, or even in the Cold War, to spread peace and democracy and prosperity, and it will easily survive small amounts of voting for Eurosceptic parties, British crankiness, and it is the fundamental stability of this order that has permitted it to do something like enlarge. Therefore, we have reached the end of Europe.